Okay, then I will start. Welcome to you all. I excuse that I'm interrupting some of you, but we have a program here and we have to respect all the speakers because if it gets later and later, the last one is really
That's me.
squeezed out, so that we won't have that. So pleased to introduce three speakers to you on this first session in the afternoon. It's called the semiotics of identity, so that's promising. And we will start with Professor Moises Orpali. Those of you who are in the room won't need any introduction, but either way, I will introduce him to you. He's Professor Emeritus of Jewish History, has had several administrative tasks at the university. He was Dean of the Faculty of Jewish Studies, or Chairman of the Department of General History in the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Judaism at Bar-Ilan, where he has held Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lau Chair for the study of leadership in times of crisis. So when we have crisis, call Moises. He has authored various books, and we know him as a scholar of polemics in medieval literature. He has published on Emanuela Boak, Nomologia. He showed me the book of Santa Fe in Goa, and several books with beautiful editions, but also studies. So he's really an expert on our field. In December 2005, he was nominated as a corresponding academic member of the Royal Academy of History in Madrid, and in 2016 again as corresponding academic member of the Royal Spanish Academy, the Real Academia Española. From 2012 to 2018, he was the academic director of the CEPAT Academic College, and currently he's also a member of the Israel National Academy of Ladino. So he will talk about wordplay in Converso and Spanish Golden Age discourses. Could you the floor, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair of the session. Wordplay and it's not an invention of the Iberian Peninsula and not of the Converso. We find it in ancient times, and it was a very prominent characteristic of Semitic literary expression. The Hebrew Bible in particular makes regular use of this linguistic device, finding it fundamentally the result of the structure of Semitic languages, but its employment is often guided by specific narrative elements. Such wordplay is rarely intended merely to startle the ear or even the eye, but rather carries with it the capacity to communicate ideas that give a distinctly ambiguous quality to the overall context of narration. I'm not going to deal not on Bible examples and not on Kabbalistic examples, even I made allusion to that. But if someone is intrigued or is interested, I'm meaning to the ambiguity in sexual allusions on the Arum and Necht with the snake, Adam and Eve, or you must all remember the word aletena, fig leaves, confronting with aletana, leaves of Lucy. This is one of the examples. The other is with the angel and Agar, when the angel of God said to Agar, Malach, Malach, angel, but Malach, what's going with you? So we have such other examples that I'm not going to deal for reasons of space and time, as I was told, not to exceed. So I'll begin directly with the Iberian Peninsula, with the riots that swept Spain in the spring and summer of 1391 and created a new social class. Those who had been baptized by force were now irrevocably Christians according to canon law. The sincerity of their faith was always under suspicion, as was the faith of their descendants. Among these conversos, Anton Montoro, who survived into the reign of Fernando and Isabel, is one of the most famous poets of the great expulsion from Spain. An Orthodox dealer by trade, he had a profoundly satirical turn of mind and constantly refers to his condition as a former Jew. He lived in a period when public Judaism was still legal in Spain, and various members of his family remained Jewish through their lives. These included his children as well as his grandchildren, father, mother, and sister. He looked upon his new Christianity with bitter remorse. All crowdmen, bitter and sad, never I had. I denied the Creator. I worship the purpose. I heard the Mass. I pray. I sanctify myself time and again. And never have I been able to cover the tracks of my, I translate conversion, but in the original Spanish, my track of puto viejo judío. Yeah. Okay. This satirical treatment of Christianity pales before the blasphemous content of another of his verses, in which he states that if Queen Isabel had lived at the time of the conception of Jesus, God would have preferred her to the Virgin Mary. I'm reading. Lofty Queen and Sovereign, had you been born before Saint Anne, the Son of God would have received his human form from you. So this blasphemy did not go unnoticed. A fellow poet suggested that Montoro was worthy to be burned at the stake for this verse. An anonymous 15th century poem illustrates with great effect the degree to which Spanish society was divided against itself along religious lines. The poem deals with a converted Jew who seems a paragon of Christian piety when the verses are read normally. But the poet instructs his reader to use the scissors for understanding his poem correctly. It is the wordplay or the planning. Without cutting this verse, we can read. You always gave alms to Christians. You never ridiculed the poor. You believed in the Roman popes. You never believed in God's press. You are devout of Our Lady. You are an opponent of all heresy. You gladly renounce the ancient Torah. You are a great servant of Saint Mary. But by dividing the verses as the author instructed, we can read. You always ridicule the poor. In your soul, you believe in God of wrath of Our Lady. You are an oppressor. The ancient Torah, you are a great servant. Alms to Christians you never gave. The Roman popes you never believed in. You are not a devotee of the Virgin Mary. You gladly renounced her. This poem demonstrates with graphic clarity the split in Spanish society, not only between people of different heritage, but even more disturbingly with the individual. As the 15th century progressed, laws of purity of blood excluded descendants of Jews from all lucrative professions, and later from the possibility of obtaining permit to immigrate to the New World. With the expulsion of the Jews, everyone became suspect of carrying Jewish blood. Those known to be converts were often shunned like lepers. Alfonso Cano, a Spanish artist of the Renaissance, is said to have discarded his cloak after being jostled by a converso of the streets of Granada, never to wear the garment again. A conversa, weight nurse might transmit the tendency of heresy by merely suckling an old Christian babe. The absolute refuse to consider the possibility that a descendant of Jews could be a sincere Christian is stated succinctly in the Spanish proverb. I'm citing, un asno de 10 años es viejo, y un confeso de ciento es nuevo. There is to be found here a veiled reference to the term cristiano nuevo, cristiano viejo. The racial and religious malaise of Spanish society is omnipresent in the literature of this period. The various social and religious tensions that the presence of conversos created could appear almost anywhere and at any time as a symptomatic psychological obsession that needed only a word or a gesture to surface full-blown in novels, plays, and poetry. In examples from Spanish literature, the mere suggestion of Judaism often evoked a veritable storm of wordplay. This spanning is strangely similar to the Semitic examples in the Bible, and ironical we can locate its origins, at least partially, in the tendency for punning evident in that literature. In short, a literary device characteristic of Semitic writings became in the post-expulsion discourse what we might refer to as a signal of anxiety and the Jewish self-suspicion rampant in Spanish of the period. In chapter 6 of Castiglione, Cortegiano, we read in Spanish, not in Italian. I'm studying. While dining with the great captain Diego de Quiñones, another Spaniard who was eating with me then asked for wine, vino. Diego replied, yes, he came, vino, and you did not recognize him, thus labeling him as a Marran. The reference here is obviously to the three-bar contention between Jews and Christians concerning whether the Messiah has arrived or is yet to come. This wordplay humorously illustrates the obsessive suspicion that no Christians were lurking even in the legions of the Catholic King. The 17th century satirist and poet Francisco Quevedo, in his work El Buscón, makes an especially sly comment that reflects his Spanish neurosis. I'm citing, this Portuguese called himself Señor Vasco de Menezes. He was a knight of the primer boat, I mean, rider of Christ. Final of the sea. Portugal was considered a land overrun by Jews, and the word Portuguese substitute for Jew in numerous passages of Spanish literature. Indeed, the Portuguese immigrants to the New World were perpetually under the suspicions of the Inquisition and were persecuted as Jews through the 17th century. The Primer Cartilla refers here specifically to the book used to teach the children catechism. Each lesson began with the sign of the cross, Christus, inscribed at the top of each page. This Portuguese, as a knight of the Christus, is therefore understood to be a mere beginner in Christianity. Again, in his work by Quevedo, we find an almost slapstick passage fraught with irony and innuendo. A miserable schoolmaster starves his pupils, but decides to supplement their major fare after hearing an offhand public comment concerning purity of blood. The master means of dispelling this rumor read as follows. I'm citing. He had an iron box perforated with holes, just like a tea strainer. He opened it and put a piece of bacon in it, as much as would fit. He tied it with a string and dipped it in the pupil's broth so that some flavoring of the bacon might seep through the holes. After he dipped it in, he kept the bacon for use on other occasions. It remembers our grandmothers from Poland with the tea, right? With this side. Through this absurd account, Quevedo puns on the supposed avoidance of pork by conversos, implying that the scholar master secretly observes Jewish dietary law. He also emphasizes that obsessive fear of being recognized publicly as a descendant of Jews, that is, as a new Christian. But most amusing, perhaps, is the name Quevedo gives to the apparatus used by the scholar master. The strainer is called a salvadera. This word reminds one of salvar, to save, and is for the schoolmaster the savior and redeemer of his good name and image. One of the most common puns in Spanish Golden Age literature relies on the word esperar, to wait. The reference here is to the Jewish insistence that the Messiah is yet to arrive. Wait, writes a character in a Spanish 17th century drama, to which the answer comes, I'm citing, I never wait, for I am a pure Christian, and glory be to God. I descend from no tribe. End of the psalm. Another author referring to lovers who wait longly for their ladies stated, I'm citing, these gallants have something in common with Jews. Witless wait. It should be noted that Judaism is sometimes represented as a tree that bears no fruit in Christian iconography, a withered branch. Killing the same bird with two stones, Castillo Solorzano writes, I'm sitting, his nose was as long as the Jew man's waist. Again, they will. This type of panning is encountered in Spanish Golden Age literature in innumerable variations. The hackneyed name of the Jew that waits endlessly for the Messiah is used with outrageous buffoonery, as if these authors were secretly or perhaps unconsciously ridiculing a fundamental belief of the church, that Jesus is the true Messiah and Savior. Yet, beneath this overt and disposable humor, we find a genuine malaise. Many of the authors of this period were themselves new Christians and had practiced Judaism secretly in their youth, as we saw this morning in your lecture. Any accusation of Judaism raised against them might bring serious consequences to their careers. They might even be summoned by the Inquisition and made to reveal the names of sacred Jews known to them. The mere rumor of Jewish descent produces social and psychological state of anxiety that belies the humorous tone of this passage. Even all Christians falsely accused might be forced to reveal their knowledge of Judaizers or even their mere suspicions in the chambers of the Inquisition. The national obsession with Jews became an ambivalence directed against Spanish society at large, a collective state of paranoia, bordering on the delusion that could taint social relations at every level. This said states of affairs reflects a profound distrust of self, a several ambivalence comparable to the process of splitting described in the psychoanalytical literature with regard to psychosis and paranoid passions. After the expulsion, Spain became a society in which the former hostility directed against residents, not Christians, could now only be turned against itself. In psychoanalytic terms, the distractions of the hated object in fantasy also represent a potential distraction of a part of the self. In order to understand this, with regard to Spanish anti-Judaism of the period, it is first necessary to appreciate the extent to which Spain's Jews and Islamic populations influenced the native culture. Jews, Muslim, and Christians had coexisted in Spain for over 700 years. Coexisted is a word relative in this circle of academicians, despite intermittent periods of mutual distrust and hostility. Spain had become an important center of both Jewish and Islamic culture. And when the Catholic monarchs united the country, they came to one highly pluralistic society in which no Christian characteristics had become essential to any cultural identity that Spain may have possessed. To persecute and tear out these non-Christian populations was tantamount to subverting and denying formative elements within Spanish society and culture. This can be described psychoanalytically as analogous to the destruction of the self objects, of subjective objects that constitute the formative component of the self. In addition, a large population of conversos remained, and these new Christians contributed to the Spanish national identity in numerous ways. Inquisitional policy inevitably became an expression of self-destruct and even self-hatred in a society where those who were persecuted and despised had already left their indelible mark. Post-expulsion Spain suffered from a cultural neurosis that has its analogy in the device and an ambivalent condition of the individual neurotic. And it is these states of affairs that gave rise to a dangerous repressive atmosphere in which the ambiguity of panning and wordplay became an essential form of destructive self-expression. The diverse examples of panning that can be found in Golden Age literature share a number of important features in common. By examining them together, it is possible to discover something concerning the uses of panning in general and subsequently concerning the various specific historical, social, and psychological contexts in which panning comes to life. In each case, wordplay creates ambiguity in an otherwise stable text, and it is this ambiguity that first confronts the reader by disrupting an otherwise ordered sequence of thought events. The observant reader is forced to stop and ponder an incongruity that frustrates clear understanding. Contradictory meanings and disordered association create a suspicion that the text is trying to express something in direct conflict with its overt aims and purposes. In this way, the initial ambiguity created by panning and wordplay reveals a profound ambivalence that always escapes our attempts to find congruence and resolution. Wordplay can therefore be read as a sign or signal of conflict, which the plain text, for all its efforts, are consistently and single-mindedness cannot efface. At bottom, this ambivalence is the product of an anxiety compulsively that appears in the form of a pan, despite all attempt at concealment. Panning invariably points to an underlying dissonance. It can do so consciously or unconsciously, but in either case represent a breakdown in meaning that is produced when the plain text moves precariously close to the entity producing conflict. Understood in this manner, panning as a product of literary culture becomes analogous to a psychological symptom that simultaneously conceals and discloses unconscious conflict with the individual side. In the case of the biblical pans that I begin with, wordplay reveals both an element of what the biblical author wanted to explain, sexual anxiety, or a anxiety related to the problems of patrimony or usurpation of the patriarchs, etc. The destructive consequences of sexual sin is never made explicit in Genesis 3, but re-examining the light of its panning, we find an element of sexuality that is disturbingly close to the surface of the narrative, like was in Genesis 21 and 27. Panning constitutes an underlying discourse that parallels the struggles of the patriarchs to establish a nation, but one that portrays them as usurpers, especially in the case of Jacob, whose name itself can be read as scoundrel. With the addition of the title Israel, Jacob's status as father of the nation is made concrete, and yet the underlying connection between Jacob, the scoundrel, and Jacob, the father of the nation, is never successfully suppressed by the plain text. Ambiguity and ambivalence return in the form of pants that perpetuate a state of tension and anxiety discernible to the sensitive reader. I'm escaping the Kabbalistic space to let time, and I'm concluding in the examples from post-expulsion literature. This division within the social and psychological self becomes even more volatile. It was a rejection and subsequent denial of the underlying Jewish influences on Spanish society that produced a distressing state of ambivalence and anxiety with its individuals. Spain, after expulsion, was a nation chronically suspicious of itself, and the persecution of conversos created a psychological malaise reflecting nothing so much as an insidious spaces of self-hatred that became increasingly virulent, and the Inquisition escalated its policy of dealing with sacred Jews. Spain of this period was obsessed with the problem of its own Jewishness, both real and imagined. And is this irreconcilable tension that produces a storm of panic whenever a narration wanders too close to the underlying conflict. By focusing on wordplay in Spanish literature and comparing this material to various similar examples, we witness the irony of a literary device characteristic of Semitic writings from the earliest written records, now turned to anti-Semitic purposes. Panic is not an exclusively Semitic form of literary diction, but its relation to wordplay in Spanish literature becomes increasingly evident when we recognize and acknowledge the sweeping influence of Judaism on Spanish society as a whole. This becomes doubly ironic when we realize, with the help of psychology, that the extent of this influence is measurable in inverse proportion to Spain's obsessive hatred of all things that smell Judaism. Thank you very much. Not to the Inquisition, but to all my dear friends, that this idea of analysis has been developed when I stay here in the first semester with the help of the mega cognition was history and psychology that we're very happy to combine. So this is the
There will sure be some questions, both on the general nature of this talk and how funds work and on specifics. So, David, you first.
Thank you, Moises. The examples you've provided are really fantastic. This is very stimulating to me. Just a couple of observations for all their worth. Maybe they're quite obvious to people, but it's obviously you've drawn our attention to the, you might say, the mechanics, the logistics of successful or at least challenging polemics. And I couldn't help but contrast this to Sasportas, who it seems is only interested in asserting some sort of authoritarian right of control. The subtlety of the authors that you're talking about, tells me that there has to be an understanding of how the authors need to know how to generate the tension that necessitates the polemic or the defense, the apologetic. And I mean, we don't count with polls of people who read Montoro and read Sasportas simultaneously to see who liked what or whatever, but I suspect that, you know, influence is in large measure a question of this kind of psychological insight, you know, how one has to manipulate language to create, among other things, plausible deniability and the tension and the ambiguity, the incongruity that we're talking about. So that's basically it.
No,
I kind of combine the two ideas.
no, you're right, because we can have the reaction in the poetry and the fragments of literature that other writers wrote, trying to show themselves more Christians than this false author that is writing this poem. So it creates another discourse, less apologetic and more
Polemic,
more polemic, more competitive, yes, more aggressive. The role of Sasportas was another thing. It was writing to impose, to keep the identity, the whole identity of the community.
Then again, there was no ambiguity in the identity, as far as I can tell, of Sasportas. I mean, he had different traditions to try to harmonize, but it wasn't his identity that was at issue. And here we have people who are really in the throes of being defined and defining themselves.
Right, you're right.
Just a little remark that might be very fitting to what you said. You know, the Benedetto Croce is La Spagna nella vita italiana. I don't remember now the exact citation, but he says the Spanish needed the Inquisition because they felt they were uncomfortable themselves. They were heretics. Which Italians we don't need. Our identity is fine. We don't need this. So this goes very well with what you were saying. And I enjoy the examples. Fantastic.
Thank you. This is very interesting that the contra-inquisition discourse is different here in Spain, but on the same direction. For example, in Portugal, Saraiva, it says that they invented the Inquisition is the closer. If I going back to Montoro, the cloth is already prepared, but the bottom, the Inquisition. In Spain, we have also an idea, not like this, but to erase all the medium social strata. Usually, I wrote down the name.
I like to know that.
Thank you.
Because we have many questions, so
Okay, I'll be very quick. I just, to my ear, one of the first examples that you gave, where it was about the cutting, you cut the text in different and the meaning's the opposite.
Yeah.
Sounded very differently than the 20 examples that you brought. I think that were from plays, like those gallants.
Yes.
On the Encounter. And so I just wanted to, what it sounds a little bit like in the difference is that the more playful ones, or those examples anyway, are almost, they're the meta awareness of the obsession. They're making fun of the fact that everyone thinks about this all the time, rather than necessarily obsessing themselves about the question. So I'm really putting that.
No, I understand the question.
Is there a difference in the way that they're using this, referring to you rather than taking?
Yes, I understand the question. I selected more funny, let's say like that, for my audience, because I'm not going to tell you, take out your scissors and cut this text and this and this, or let's read like this idea. But there is this and that. It was really
Well, there was a moment when people were burned,
yeah.
and Montoro was living this time, and in the 17th century, it was a quite different.
You
Yeah.
can
Moment,
put,
so
Yes.
you can put big text also.
But
Yes.
no,
Yes, it is precisely what you said, and to think, thank you so much, fantastic, very, very inspiring. Now, on the one hand, and this has to do with Harm's comments, especially at certain moments, the Iberian Peninsula was very fond of punning each other on different things. And if we focus on the Jewish aspect, we can have a certain, impression which is right, and you revealed it. But if we also use other tropes like homophobic tropes and others, then we have a society who love to attack each other on personal basis, on satirical basis. And Shais over there is a specialist on this genre. Then this is on the one hand. On the other hand, the example of this edition of Baltasar Castiglione is very interesting, at least to me, and that's to do with Anne, because if we take into consideration that what Peter Berg said, that Il Cortigiano was a way to civilize people, when you integrate an anti-Jewish pun, you are making one thing and the opposite. On the one hand, you are integrating anti-Semitic tropes, but you are domesticating it. You are transforming it as less harming. Okay, it's not sympathetic, but it's part of the conversazione, of the sprezzatura. And in this sense, we have perhaps a different result concerning the use of these tropes. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. I think we have a question of Francis.
Thank you. I have dealt many years ago with the jokes. There were anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim jokes all the time, and this compilation of jokes. And I always felt uncomfortable about it. So I'm glad that you are developing this kind of approach, because it is very difficult to interpret. You can interpret it as domestication.
Sometimes,
you can
as Anne said,
you can interpret it as an art of insult, which doesn't really concern people, real people. That is a bit the position of David Nierenberg related to Judaism. But even if it's, and I like very much his book, by the way, but even if it doesn't concern real people, at the end, real people are affected. So, Mike, it's not really a question, it's a declaration of discomfort, because it's really difficult to grab this, because it has different circumstances.
Glancy Edward deals a little bit deal with referent anti-Semitic. Thank you.
So I have Kirsten and Brian. Yeah, thank you very much. And very shortly, because we have to move on. Yeah, but I don't want to suppress your. Thank you. Just a little suggestion. There might be the possibility to come to a less pathological, perhaps more a positive view of these subtleties of semantic exercises from a certain point of view. I remember when under the Cold War, when poets and writers emigrated from the east to the west, they usually were very happy with the liberty that was there, but were disappointed by the lack of sensitivity that their audience had, because they could express themselves in Czechoslovakia or Eastern Germany or wherever, and they would catch everything, all the subtleties of the language, because they were living under a regime that very strongly policed speech. So I have the impression that punning is also a form of resistance under a regime that is very very attentive to these proposiciones and to language in general. And of course, punning is also used against minorities as in this case. But it might be part of a larger linguistic strategy. That's just an idea.
Thank you very much.
And then we go to the next.
Thank you very much for letting me feel at home as well. I think with the line that
Doug was saying. And it's very well. So there's these two kind of merging fronts, we can say that. The opposite mathematics and the commedia. The comedy was using the funds to combine with the opposite mathematics that was like with the didactic idea of race, and all of this, the allegoric figures about Judaism. In my personal also thought is that, especially with Quevedo, he needed maybe a little bit more to learn a little bit more from the conversus and from the Judaic mindset of humor, because it's self-criticism, but he never did that. It was also always against the other. So do you see any kind of like, that was my biggest deception, I think, in the research that I did. I thought that I would find a lot of that hidden self-criticism to indicate some sort of a Jewish humor from the past, but I didn't encounter that much. Even with the conversos, I think maybe, I don't know if it's, maybe you can refer to that, is it the fear from the Inquisition that they didn't go that far? Where was the limit of the funds from not to reveal that much of oneself?
I think the past in the case of Quevedo and others, following your nice reception of the book, makes self-defense. I thought here about self-destruction and attack. Like to ask him to find negative position to one's positive position. I think this, in this case, is making self-defense of himself to erase attacks.
Well, Moises, thank you so much. So, just to remind you of one of the most vitriolic poems in Spanish language by Quevedo, Érase un hombre a una nariz pegado, which has so many levels of significance. It starts with the physical traits, which you don't see often in the literature, but then it really goes deep, and it's a very nasty poem, really. So they've been splendid. Now we go to Professor José Alberto Tavim. He had his doctoral diploma in the New University of Lisbon. He's a senior researcher and professor at the Center of History, School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Lisbon, and also collaborator and member at the Research Center Stedius in the University of Évora. He's the chair of the seminar, The Jews in Portugal in the Diaspora, in the University of Lisbon, was invited to form part of the scientific board of the Lisbon's Jewish Museum. We know him all as the author of books, 2 books, and more than 60 articles, and I was impressed with all the languages just listed here: Turkish, Arabic, Hebrew, Italian, Castilian, French, Portuguese. And who knows the work by C. Alberto, know that he always uncovers new unknown things and documents, and he goes deep. He really does a thorough job. It's lovely to see you here and to hear you about belonging, not belonging, and Isaac Matthias as well, wasn't it? Yeah, okay.
Thank you, so.
But perhaps the camera, because they want to see you. Perhaps it's better
On the other side,
Well,
to be,
I have to move, yeah,
perhaps.
and we can move this.
Yes,
you know,
please.
Please be comfortable. I don't want to bother too much with the people who are not.
Please, please.
You can take it to the.
You have done this.
And move.
Sí, aquí de derecha, izquierda.
So, first of all, I'm very grateful to David and to Claude to invite me to be here in this conference with my colleagues. So, we're going to speak about this manuscript that I found in the British Library, where in my post-doctoral PhD, when I was in London. So it was very funny. It was a very funny situation. So I rent
a room in an apartment in London where I didn't know who is married with who it was, because people is always changing there. So I thought that it was a continuation of the family story when I found. So there are versions of the manuscript called Relações Cantigas, etc., dated from Amsterdam 1683. In the beginning, one kept in the British Library and the other in the Brussels Royal Library. So this second, I just read this version 2 years ago when I was in a mission in Brussels. However, the Brussels version is later, as it includes a final text from 1689. Both have been the subject of separate studies, and it's only recently that the comparative analysis of their content has been carried out by Jacob Sanches Hermida from Salamanca University, but I don't know the person, I just know the studies. So, what is the reason for the existence of the two versions? It turns out that the Brussels version is for David, para David, probably the compiler's second son, written on the first page, implying that it would be a less perfect copy to Centaur close relative. Our hypothesis is based on the fact that other works ordered by the compiler are dedicated to his beloved son, David Aboab Curiel. This David will probably be out of place in the Hague, as it was there that this version later owners remained, some Huguenot librarians, being sold in Amsterdam to the Royal Library in Brussels in 1872. And this is also possibly the reason why the compiler commissioned again the calligrapher to make another version. So who is the compiler? Sorry. All right. The compiler was the author and scholar Isaac Mattathias Aboab, who was identified in both versions. Isaac was born in Amsterdam in 1631 and died there in 77. He was the son of Manuel Dias Henriques, it means Mattathias Aboab, born in Porto in 1594, and Isabel Pina, it means Esternar, born in Tumbán in 1599, and persecuted by the Inquisition of Mexico in 1626. The merchant Isaac Mattathias Aboab was the author of several literary pieces, including Doutrina Particular and the famous Comédia de la Vida e Sucessos de Joseph, that it was published yet by Michael Macquart. So, Isaac Mattathias Aboab is also the author of a journal, genealogy, whose title is Livro em Notas de Idades Reduzida por mim, Isaac Aboab, and that it was published by Israel Salvatore Reva. Also, according to Reva, he was Parnas at the famous Talmud Torah Yeshiva. He also commissioned copies of several works from his associate, the calligrapher, copyist, editor, and painter, Benjamin Senor Godinez, which we will discuss below. This is the case of Ordem de Benedicciones, of 1684. He also ordered that we make a copy of Cavalete de Flores by Salomão de Oliveira, the Tratado de Medicina from Zacuto from 69, and the maravilhoso discurso sobre a compostura do corpo humano from 1691. So, if we compare the letter in those manuscripts and one in our text, the Relações Cantigas, etc., we can realize that the letter is the same. As according to Jean-Louis Charles Jacob, is also the same of a text whose title is Perguntas sobre diversas matérias e respostas de oráculos, etc. Tratado de grande entretenimento para em companhia de homens e mulheres. You can see, sorry. Is the livro de Pretas, but I will speak this later. So, treating of great entertainment for in the company of men and women, young men and young girls, spend an hour of the night with great laughter. So, grande galhofa. This is a time where there was no television. So this is an occasion to educate the people, the young, the adolescents, in a funny way, not in a heavy way. So this means that the compiler is Isaac Matatias Aboab, but who executes the text is the artist, and probably his protégé Benjamin Senior Godinez, since its execution required stylistic skills that Isaac would not have. Benjamin is maybe the author of the phrases in this portrait of Memento Mori, as the letter is very similar. I'm speaking about the Latin characters, with some changes, for example, in the way of drawing the L, because the execution of a sentence in a painting cannot be the same when using another support as the paper. A global analysis of Isaac's works or of those he compiled seems to imply that he was a moralist, that he is someone very attached to the education and good manners of his children and other members of his family, but also to practical life, that is to the future of professional performance, either when indicating the standards of good social practices or when writing the book, for example, livro que dá notícias de todas as pedras preciosas that you can find in the Rosentaliana library, and there is of course a copy here, there is the microfilm, and it is not only about the material value of the stones, it's also a metaphorical, about the metaphorical value of the stones. So, the most interesting of the documents to appreciate the passion and intention of Isaac Matatias Aboab is certainly the Memento Mori, revealing a Christian influence carried out by the Saint Benjamin Senior Godinez between 1679 and 1681, and which you can find in the London Jewish Museum. In this portrait, the corpse that Isaac is looking towards raised his left arms and showed two scrolls on which is written in Spanish. Oh, you, I have to translate myself. How you look at me, take care to live well, that you know neither the hour nor the moment you will see yourself like this too. Do what you want, have done when you die. Of course, Isaac, looking at the corpse, is Isaac Matatias Aboab, whose name we can read in the lower part of the portrait in Hebrew characters, and who appears very well dressed. It seems the Marquis of Pombal, no? With a and colorful clothes, accompanied by a little black slave boy, also very well dressed. In the background, a landscape confused life in Spanish America, that of his parents, with mountains and Indian, I mean, maybe Maya, pyramid, and the Dutch land with the cemetery, most likely Jews, probably all the time. So in this portrait, there is an exhortation to live life well, so important to a man who also wrote a treatise on ethics called Shun Evil and Do Good from 1677. Down in the portrait, we can read by the insignificant Senior, it means Benjamin Senior Godinez, commissioned by Isaac ben Matatias Aboab, and here. But it's very interesting because the Spanish phrase, "Oh, tu que estás mirando, mira bien, que vivas bien," you can find also in the manuscripts. So this proves that there is an intrinsic relationship between the two manuscripts and the painting, but also that it identify the compiler and his investment in the role of educator. So, but this portrait, it really makes part of a triptych. The second picture is also centered on the person of Isaac, this time the patriarch. In a bucolic environment, parade his ligature and his salvation by the divine will, And on the other part, his life as agriculture. The two parts separated by a welcoming door, also accompanied by excerpts of Pentateuch, Psalms, and Proverbs. The words inscribed on the door, "Blessed are you when you come in, blessed are you when you go out," is a sign of welcome displayed in homes and synagogues. So in general, and in contrast with the previous Ars Moriendi of the first painting, the second painting seems to evoke exact desire to identify himself with the archetype of the patriarch, who, obeying God, lives to make the fields fertile. It's a metaphor, of course. The third picture is very well known, deals with the topic of charity and justice. Dirty towards one neighbor is recalled here in the categories of fairness and generosity, symbolized by a scale on the right and by a hand giving a coin to another hand on the left, framing the 10 Commandments inscribed on the tree of life, about the allegorical verse that says of the Lord, it is a tree of life for those who grasp it. Thus, the triptych seems to point to a message of affirmation from Isaac Mattathias Aboab, the man who became rich with business in the West Indies, and who was chosen in 1691 to deliver a speech during the official visit of William III of Orange, King of England, to the Portuguese synagogue. The idea of creating a triptych also seems to have roots in the Christian universe, like the triptychs of Calvary. But here again, the message works as in our manuscript. Only in the formal plan comes from the Christian universe, and in it, the foundation of the Jewish universe replaced the Christian theology. And also at the foundation of the Jewish universe, Isaac de Mattathias Aboab wanted to show himself as the herald of the fundamental by becoming equal to the patriarch Isaac. That is, he became a kind of patriarch Isaac of the new types. Let's go back to the picture. In the central one, Jacob occupies the same place as Christ on the Calvary, but with a completely different profile, of course. He is the center of a generation of industrious people who pass the test of obedience to God. The memento mori takes the place of material experience from the portrait of the well-decked merchant with his servant to exotic fields, and then the silence of death, the cemetery and the corpse that admonish him to live well. On the other side of the triptych, there is a pictorial illustration of living according to the God principles of Jewish law. The triptych thus presents itself as a visual and powerful synthesis of the message, subtly conveyed in the several words written, produced, or curated by the compiler. Isaac Mattathias Aboab is already mentioned, the emulator of the patriarch, whose objective is, in addition to material success, labor, Arcadia, to transmit to his offspring and others the keys to success according to the strict obedience to the principles of the law. Thus, in the spectrum of Iberian Catholic formality, a policy of education for life emerged that, like the tree of life depicted, is embodied in the 10 Commandments. This is not, of course, an idiosyncrasy. This ideology permeates the community of the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, as you can see in the famous case of Rabbi Yuda Leon Temple and his outlines to build the Portuguese synagogue inspired in the Temple of Solomon. So, but what is more interesting in the case of Isaac Mattathias Aboab is the evidence that this ideological strategy became a policy extend to many members of the community. So, the purpose of the compilation. It seems to us that this compilation, that seems very naive at the beginning, had precisely these two purposes in the context of privacy. Professor Anden Boer Use the case of Isaac Matatias Aboab as an example of the taste of these Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, that is a living treasure of their cultural interest. Indeed, in 1685, he will recommend to his son to occupy his free time by devoting himself to reading livros espanhóis de divertimento e documentos. Thus, alongside scholarly works like Nomologia or El Conciliador de Menasega in Israel, he mentioned a book of tales in the hand. Interestingly, his warning from Isaac was titled Documentos para todo Estado e Idade e, em particular, para habituar os moços desde a sua mocidade à virtude, from 1677. Therefore, this compiled documentation aims to form the Jewish politician to be a virtuous, correct, expert in business, and educated, that is to say, peer of a multifaceted culture that would allow him to be a kind of reproduction of Isaac Matatias Aboab himself. In the most important and influent families, it is the private task of the father to prepare his children for success in life, which includes material efficiency and the acquisition of cultural knowledge, which allows for versatility and desired social projection. To achieve this goal, he should provide children with means of knowledge, which Isaac does, or else hire a school to do so. However, the goal was the same, to give the descendants the means to stay healthy and to maintain the good reputation of the family. This is why in the portrait of Godinez, under the feet of Isaac Matatias Aboab, we can read, Una anima tienes y no más, si la pierdes, ¿qué harás? Now we have to explore the second question. There is no doubt that we are talking about people closely linked to Hispanic culture and its values, language, and culture. A fact already pointed out for so many historians of the Amsterdam community. So it would not be surprising that these Portuguese Jews continue to be interested in these compilations of useful and valuable texts. But it seems to be a question here also of pedagogy. Moral education can be instilled through religion and austere counsel, but it is possible that these moral teachings are soft in text where they are obvious but less pronounced. What we guess, however, is the weight of private education in the hands of men like Isaac Matatias Aboab. Finally, we must highlight an important aspect. If the basis of the pedagogical work is made of materials from the Iberian Catholic, there is logical distance and sometimes a biting irony that serves to delimit the religious universe of which Isaac was openly proud. The portrait of Godinez and the text which appear there and which one also find in the two collections refer logically to the ideology of the Christians' memento mori, the ars moriendi, and the dance of the dead, and its derivatives were reflected in Christian literature and pictorial art. However, if we look closely at the table of Godinez, we will see that is filled with text in Hebrew, extracts from Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Genesis, Deuteronomy, etc. Even at the bottom of the painting, the name of the pattern also appeared in Hebrew, as if it was a reinforcement of the identity field of the person represented in the painting, who otherwise could be read as a Christian gentleman. And besides, I'm now speaking about the manuscript. There is text there that show a real disgust for certain aspects of the Christian world. So, for example, there is this text, for example, about the King Dom Sebastião, that it was very well known because it's anti-Jewish politics. there is a text saying, matar ao rei não és mal hecho. Antes afirmo eu ser cochilo dele que o matarei. So this is something connected with the Paulinho Sebastiano dos Rodeos de Marruecos. And to recall the horror of the Inquisition, there is also some text. I want to show this text about, Fernão Dalvar Melo. So the verses were published by Herman Prince Salomon in his book about Fernão Dalvar Melo. And the verses from one Jewish friend tried to say that he's not in a good place, he should run away to Amsterdam or to other places where he could be a free Jew. But perhaps the most interesting of this text is a small text about the Inquisition, where is written, it is terrible, sad, and frightening that the people called the Second Court. The coward quickly becomes the thief, and the ignorant is the one who is the most conscious. Here the right is done, the criminal, swearing what he has not seen nor dreamed. Here mouths are made and their tricks so that Christians become Jews. This is therefore a summary of the matter of the court, who are working with concealed accusers so that the accused cannot defend himself against the accuser, as ordered in the Bull Meditatio Cordis of 1547. So it is precisely for this reason that the collection of the sage Isaac Mattheus of Beauvoir also contains an ode to the coming of the Messiah. Very interesting, entailing the greatest chastisement for the Christian, a lesser one for the Turks, the most benevolent and welcoming, representing here the Islamic world and the redemption of the Jews, the heart of persecution. So I go to it in Spanish. Va viene el Mesías de altos cielos, con sofá de oro trae en la mano, matando, viene cristiano, y turco herindo, que com alegria a todos Israel viene redimindo, que com alegria, quando vendrá madre aquele dia, que com alegria. So I can see the ideology here. So I don't have time to speak about the difference of the two versions, the Brussels and the London, but we can see, but Jacob Yermida wrote about this, there is some differences. Some texts were passed out from the previous version, and there was a kind of actualization in the new version. So the second version, that maybe it was at the ends of the son, that David, have more accurate text about what is happening in Portugal. So, the most interesting is two texts from a different hand. So it's not really now Benjamin Senhor Godinez that wrote this text. It's another person. And it is one text about the Padre Antonio Vieira and the other about what is happened in a church in Santarém. So we were more modern times, so contemporary to David, to the son of Magalhães. So the sentence do Padre Antonio Vieira, lida na cela da Inquisição de Coimbra, culminates all the revenge exercised by the Holy Office against one of its fiercest and most lucid critics, the famous Jesuit Father Antonio Vieira. At the same time, one of the men most favorable to the total resumption of relations with exiled Jews. We must remember his mission in the Netherlands to defend the interest of the first king of the Bragança dynasty and his friendship with Manasseh ben Israel, so that they would feel safe returning to Portugal. As Christians, what never happened, as you know. The text of an old confectioner in 1689 in the city of Santarém seems a little more mysterious. All this did this news reach the older of the Brussels version David, probably the second son of Isaac Mattathias of Oa. The text tells the story of an old pastoring sheep was stabbed to death, her feet nailed and dragged to the foot of a cross. A dagger with a silver handle was nailed to the same cross. And on the door of the church, a paper was posted that said, "We went 7, and one of them killed her, and the 6 to keep. It was not to steal, because we must all give long life to all of Moses." The perpetrators committed the crime because the old woman had blasphemed against Jewish law before them. This text seems to be a Jewish counterfeit and therefore at the same time a defensive reaction to accounts of events in which converts in Portugal were accused of desecrating elements and symbols of Christianity. The best well-known example, of course, is that of the crime Comas perpetrated in 1671 in the Church of Odivelas, of which the New Christians were accused without fundaments. However, the mention of the event in Santarém seems to refer to the famous older story of the Jewish witch accused in the Middle Ages of having told a Christian woman to steal a consecrated host with which she would make medicine against her husband's infidelity. However, the miraculous manifestation of the stolen host prompted the woman and her husband to return to the church of St. Stephen, to which it belonged. So this miraculous story gave rise to the institution of the powerful Irmandade do Santíssimo Milagre de Santarém. It is an inventive device with a cathartic aim, given that in the different works of anti-Jewish polemics in the 18th century, the New Christians were also accused of anti-Christian acts not proven factually. And so we can say that at the end of the compilation, the spell turned against the wizard. Finally, let us point out that this is a compilation of great irreverence. The beating and present irreverence for the Catholic elements that shape Iberian culture makes the reverence of the Jewish Iberianism in the land of exile to grow. And isn't it this irreverence that also shapes the memento mori of the painter Godinez with this little Isaac looking like a disguised doll, but surrounded by the sublime reverence of the sacred text in Hebrew characters. I finish here.
Thank you, Dave, for this wonderful presentation, which is many new things from me and that will be so provoking. Let's see what questions come up in the first moment.
Yeah, Jose, as usual, you're very original. What I found interesting was not just the polemic written by Aboab from Amsterdam, the polemic against the Portuguese and the Catholics, et cetera, but blaming the Turk or blaming the Sultan for repressing Messianism. It's obviously a sign of the times, but what do you actually think he is accusing? Who is he actually accusing? A Turk in the Ottoman Empire? No one would have said something like that. Outside of the Ottoman Empire, in secure Netherlands, let's say, you could say something like that. So what is he really expressing there in terms of Messianism or repression of Messianism and repression of Messianism in Turkey?
Yeah, I feel that it's a little difficult to answer to this question, because the image of the Ottoman Empire and the Turk, as the people say, is different from moment to moment and from public to public. For example, I know because I publish about this, there is a lot of printing, small printing text concerning what is happening in the Ottoman Empire, and also concerning the relations between the Sultans and the Jews. In most of the cases, they stress that the good relations between the both elements, it's a sign that God don't want them. So they are completely eradicated from the Catholic world. So there is no salvation to these people. Sometimes there is some invasions, for example, that the Sultan, when he go to conquer some place, and he was defeated, so he want to massacre the Jews in public ostentations. So that is not true. This is an invasion, but this is to prove, as the texts sometimes the author they say, that Jews are so bad that also in an empire that receives these people from the Iberian Peninsula, they are not trustable in such a way that the Ottoman Sultan want to massacre these people. So we don't have always a similar image of the relations between both. So I feel this is mirror in this type of text. So when the Messiah came, he killed all Christians, the bad Catholics, the people that persecuted the Jews, but he don't kill the Turk. He should be a little more benevolent to the Turk, because the Turk finally, they are not the same rights. They are not in the same position of the Turk, like the other nations in the Ottoman Empire. But as they welcome the Jews, so they should have a better treatment from the Messiah when they come. So this is my reading about what is written here. But of course, I'm not saying that the author of the text is Matatias Aboab, because he received these texts from several people. He ordered Benjamin Godinez to make a copy, this compilation. Of course, it's text that he likes. So there are texts, there are also romances that were published by Silverman, for example, in an article, because he feels that the son must have this information because he should be a good merchant like him. A good merchant in Amsterdam, it's not a normal people. It's not one person that go to sell diamonds to another a Dutch person. He must show a high level of culture because they deal with higher people of higher rank from the Iberian Peninsula. So it's not a common discourse of a merchant. It must show his level of culture and mostly to be at the same level of the Iberian culture.
Thank you, and then Karsten.
Yeah, thank you, Jose Alberto. I'm interested in the poem that you have shared, Belém de Bissau, which is a poem that has fascinated the late Herman Salomon, and he took it out, I think, from the Brussels manuscript and put it on the first page of his book on Fernão Alva de Mello, because this poem reflects or reflected in his mind exactly the interpretation of Antonio José Saraiva of the Portuguese Inquisition. So, what is your personal idea about this poem? Does it indeed can it be read as an objective description of the workings of the Inquisition, or should we understand it as on the basis of the personal experience of Isaac de Matatiao Aboab and perhaps his literary strategies?
Now, I feel that he has the experience of his own father and mother that were persecuted. And we know by the facts that this happened here. So he transmitted information. I'm not saying that he's the author. He's someone that collected these texts for someone. Sometimes we can divine who is the author. Sometimes we don't know who is the author. But what is more interesting is that these news reach Amsterdam. So they are actualized about what is written against the Jews. So I feel that comparing with what Antonio Saraiva wrote about this is a bit of an anachronic, as you know, but it's very interesting to speak about Saraiva because there is a problem about Saraiva and about Reva that people sometimes never think about. They have a debate that all the people knows about, but they forget that at the time there was a Marrano community that can with that all the people know by the work of Schwartz, Samuel Schwartz, now they transmit, and they keep this kind of discourse, that discussion, but a part of the reality. So they never make a relation what is happened really in the day-to-day life in Portugal at that period. The existence of Marranos that have their prayers, and this material could prove or not their discussion. To me, is the most interesting thing in in the ideas of also Antonio Saraiva. In that time, it became a part of the reality about what is discovered in Portugal. So this is another case. This is another period.
This is opening up another dimension, but I have two questions and then we should pass on and the last, my turn, Alexander. So first question.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for your illustrated lecture. And maybe I'm asking out of the context, but as you know, Aboab is my familia directa.
Sorry?
Aboab is my directa family.
Ah, okay. Sorry.
So I'm interested, what is your opinion about the genealogy that Matatias Aboab wrote about all these Aboabs? This is apologetic, this is a discourse of,
So
you see it.
so far I remember, because I was thinking about this text and about
Yes,
the
that's why I
genealogy.
say
So it was
the
published by Reva. He tried to prove, of course, that he is descendant from the Aboab family that came to Porto.
Mhm.
So we want to stress, but it's always the same strategy. It's the strategy that Miguel Levi de Barrios used in Ptolemy. He tried to stress the purity of the family. Also, and he don't speak very much about, of course, the life of his parents as conversions. He forget this part in most of the genealogy. There is only one thing that I want to advise. You don't have relations with Aboab da Fonseca.
No,
So
no,
now
I
we
know,
stress
I
this.
know.
No, someone said that Benjamin Senor Godinez, Isaac Matatias Aboab, and Isaac Aboab da Fonseca, they become for the same group, because sometimes the three names are together in the same works commissioned by Aboab. But this is an hypothesis, because Godinez also make copies to other people. But someone said, I don't want to say them, they disprove that they belong to the same group, very conservative concerning the morality, the image, the political image of the community. So this is, yeah.
Thank you. David.
Thank you, Luis Alberto. Just quickly, it seems that as an editor, Aboab was self-conscious of his role as as he put it, an industrious person who had passed the test by God and therefore needed to bequeath morality to his family. I'm wondering if you can sort of speak out loud or think out loud about this. Are we talking about I don't want to say a new phenomenon, but a phenomenon of householders who are becoming self-appointed moralists? Is this a phenomenon that is developing in the 17th century? I mean, I can't think. Maybe I'm just ignorant, but I can't think of a similar, exactly same kind of texts from earlier centuries. I mean, I think of Glicola as a woman who's doing something like this. But then before that, you see a lot of divines and genuine intellectual speaking down to the people, this is how you should behave, etc. Is this a new genre? Is this a genre that is simply growing because of social and economic conditions? What do you think?
It's a little difficult to.
I know.
No, because I don't know, I don't know many other texts like this or people with this intention. But what I feel in this case is that as he or his son want to actualize news about what is happening in Portugal, that is a way of saying, okay, we survive in the Netherlands because, as all the people know, we have special relations with the Iberian Peninsula. It's our way of life. But it is better not forget that we should not convert it to Catholicism, because there is always this pressure. And as Professor Kaplan stressed this, there is always this fear that the people have so good, there is people that converted, as you know, to, also for the higher ranks. This is a way in the end of the 17th century to say, okay, and this is also the period where there was the problem of the Netherlands come down in terms of economy. So most people went to London, etc. But I think this is a way in the special period to say, okay, we live from our relations with Iberia, but you can see that these people is always persecuting us. This is it's because this is the second one, the version from Brussels is an actualized version, proven that after all, the persecution is a way of the church in Portugal to persecute these people. So it's not allowed to be true in Portugal.
Thank you so much. So we come to the last speaker of this session, and that is Alexander van der Haven. Alexander is professor in the study of religion at the University of Bergen, Norway. Before he held several postdocs at the Hebrew University, Ben Gurion University, the Open University, each of which was concerned with religious conversion, and that's exactly the topic he will talk about, aside from doing several other projects not related to what we do at this moment. He does research on conversion to Judaism, Jewish Christianity, and Jewish Christian relations in the Dutch Republic. So he's a familiar face here in Jerusalem. We know many people, but we're still in the Dutch Republic. And I don't know if it's the 17th or the 18th century, but I welcome you and give you the floor.
Thank you, 17th century. First, let me thank David and Claude Dove for having me here. I still feel this is my wife, always calling on the right moment. Intuition. You have a hard time
Accessing your PowerPoint.
It was there. Yeah, it was there. Yeah, that is. Good, thanks. We still had the technical glitch that is mandatory. Okay, so I was saying, like, I really want to thank you two for inviting me here, because I still feel, and I think it's justified, that I'm still a novice in the field, and since I'm always distracted by all the other projects I have, I'm afraid I will be an emeritus novice.
Not novice, not novice, catechumen.
So I'll be never there. So the plan for this paper was to get a good sense of how basically were the identities of proselytes in the Dutch Republic regarded by the Sephardic Jews. And my plan was to look exactly like what language was used, so to derive from it, like how were proselytes viewed, and the outcome I feel myself is a bit disappointing. That's just not enough. So I'm going to give you there what there is. And I think the way forward would be to branch out and start looking into how the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam were actually looking at Christians, and then from there step into how they conceive conversion. Another thing is like I am going to talk about conversion identity because I'm going to argue that proselytes were often identified with new Jews. Okay, let me begin. In a 2019 article on proselytes, Joseph Kaplan, and if you haven't read this article, it's his fault because he writes too many articles. On proselytes in the Sephardic community of Amsterdam, he pointed out that although the freedoms of the young Dutch Republic's former city enabled Gentiles to convert to Judaism in an unprecedented way, this freedom had its limits. Although the city law from 1616, and you can see it here for the many Dutch readers among us, the city law from 1616 outlawing the circumcision of Gentiles and also proselytization of Gentiles was ignored in practice. It caused the Jewish community to tread with care, as for instance show the Talmud Torah 1639 bylaws that repeat this interdiction. Moreover, as Joseph Kaplan argued, also the Sephardic community itself was reluctant to embrace converts. In addition to traditional ontological distinctions between born Jews and converts, and we can blame Yehuda Halevi for this tradition, Sephardic Jews, so Kaplan proposed, have brought with them from Iberia an ideology of the purity of blood. This ideology formed an obstacle to conversion and explains the several documented instances that candidates for conversion were turned away because they were not of Jewish descent, and this reason was also explicitly given. Other indications of this ideology, Kaplan argued, were that marriages arranged for proselytes were solely with other proselytes, and that proselytes figured prominently as recipients in the charity records, suggesting they occupied a socially marginal position. If it works, it does work. As an illustration of this ideology of the purity of blood, Kaplan cites a passage from Isaac Cardozo's Las Excellencias de los Hebreos, which we already have encountered today, who called the Israelites as of noble blood and refer to their purity. So this is literally the language of the purity of blood. In addition to passages from polemical writers by Isaac Aurelio de Castro, also encountered already today, the first of these, from the Repuesta un Cavallero Francés, stated, and I'm using your English translation, Joseph, and here this is the original, for the covenant between the Lord and the seed of Abraham and the children of Israel will remain forever. And Gentiles who acknowledge the Lord of truth and worship him will be Jewish, and the Spanish is actually Gerim in Israel, beloved of their Lord. But they will never be Jews, Israel here again, nor the seed of Abraham. For Israel is not a spiritual entity, but rather a nation, whether good or bad. Although Orobio, unlike Cardozo, does not use a discourse of blood, and maybe somewhere else in his writing he does, he claimed explicitly that proselytes, namely Gentiles who acknowledge the Lord and worship him, are not Israel, but strangers, peregrinos, gerim, in Israel, thus leaping over the rabbinical tradition back to the semi-sovereign Israel kingdoms, where proselytes had a distinct status. Likewise, in his Prevenciones Divinas contra la vana idolatria de las gentes, and that's this text, Robert de Castro argued that proselytes are not Jews until their offspring, and we should here red their blood. This is, I think, a very interesting. It's almost like diluting the blood until it's not gentle anymore, becomes blended in with the Jewish nation. So neither in the older times nor today were those who took upon themselves the observance of the law of Moses called Jews, but they were called Gerim, which is what they are termed by the Holy Writ. And it is a religious duty to treat them as brothers, but without getting them the honorable name of the house of Israel until, in the course of generations, they assimilate and blend into the rest of the Jewish people. This, by the way, does show that they were expected to marry with the Jewish population. And I did actually see encounter many marriages of converts with native Jews. So, in other words, until the Gentile blood is sufficiently watered down, proselytes and their immediate offspring are not part of Israel, of the Jewish people. Well, indeed, the way Cardozo and Robio Castro's redefinitions of traditional distinctions between proselytes and born Jews seem to contradict the early modern common view that proselytes are reborn as Jews through conversion, I would like to mobilize the little that was written by and about convert. And again, I said, okay, that's just too little, but I mobilize everything. Most of which in polemical literature in the 17th century Dutch Republic. So my title's early, I extended it to the whole century to show that Cardozo's and Robio's racialized view was not necessarily dominant. Yeah, so I'm not saying like you're wrong, but it seems that there's also other views of the distinction between Israel and proselytes. As Karsten Wilke's work on fictional polemics has already shown, there were also opposite views that identify proselytes with, rather than ontologically distinguish them from, Christians of the seed of Israel. The sheer number of proselytes is already a sign that this ideology was not dominant, but here I will explore the following questions, that are these. So what do the sources themselves suggest? And I'm also using Christian sources. So I've been looking at the language, and what comes out, again, it's not surprising enough, but I feel I need to share it with you. The second is, can the reluctance to receive converts be perceived as based on an ideology of blood, or are there in fact other reasons? And were there also other counter ideologies that identified rather than distinguished between proselytes and Israelites? And I could not resist to add this picture, which is from a century later, about Lord Gordon, who in England converted to Judaism, and of course, according to the print, was converted by a Jewish woman to emphasize the emasculation of the Gentile by the Jewish people. Images have power. Okay, so Giur like birth into the Jewish nation. According to the halachic view, and so for this paper also, I started to swim into the waters of halachic history. Into the mikveh, yeah, and I almost I'm comparing this to, and I hope I didn't entirely mess up, because I'm not halachically talented. But according to the halachic view and practice, dominant since Joseph Caro, Gentiles who have been circumcised, and of course only the males, accepted by a formal or an informal Jewish court that had considered their intentions and ritually immersed, are Jews. Many halachic traditions that Caro brought together show the assumption that the Giur ritual is akin to birth. The immersion is regarded as different from immersion for purification, and previous blood and marital relations are declared void. So for this also, new rules had to be invented to prevent, for instance, a brother and a sister from marrying. Yeah, so this was like, it was taken literally. After conversion, born Gentiles become in every sense part of the Jewish people. Evidence, for instance, by that day, unlike Gentiles, have the obligation to observe all commandments, now considered transgressors of the law if they do not. Yeah, so if they convert, they can become bad Jews, which is a sign that they are Jewish. The wide acceptance of Caro's views brought, at least for a century or two, an end to several other views of conversion, two of which were first, that the motivation is irrelevant to Giur. Yeah, so motivation plays no role whatsoever. And second, that a Giur can be declared post facto invalid. Yeah, so a person is received by the Bet Din, circumcision and immersion, and afterwards we say, well, actually this person is eating pork or is not behaving in the right way, so we take it back. You can take it back. It's final. And this was an older position that by Joseph Caro was out of the picture. Now actually it has come back in the Orthodox circles, but that's a different story. The 17th century sources from Amsterdam are not willing to reveal too much. See, I've animated these sources even. That's why how I was upset with them. But there is no clear evidence that the idea that Giur signified a rebirth into the Jewish nation was rejected in belief and in practice. Although no Bet Din records have survived, and that's a real pity, other sources, mostly in snippets, suggested intention, not the most compatible factor for a racialized view, was clearly considered as important. And so, for instance, the frequent formulaic statements such as, I want to live and die in the Jewish religion. This is from a notarial act in 1636. And I intend to live and die as a Jew in the name of the Lord of Hosts, which is from a personal letter from much later in 1682. Circumcision and immersion was expected and considered also important. And you can see here, for instance, the description, and this is the paucity of the sources. This is the most detailed description of a conversion to Judaism of the 17th century. This is by Abraham Pellegrino. His autobiographic polemical piece written somewhere between the late 1610s and his death in 1652, in which he describes how he in Hamburg, whose community was very closely connected to that of Amsterdam, he was circumcised as a sign of what I came here to become, and then I immersed myself as the law commands, and I gave myself the name Abraham Pellegrino, which I think is also interesting. So I did it myself, so I was not immersed, but this is an act I did myself. Which I don't know if this is common. This name was most appropriate for me because the Lord took me out of the land of my birth, as he did with Abraham, our father. When the Gentile birth of individual proselytes is emphasized in 17th century sources from Amsterdam, it is not to distinguish them from other Jews, but presented as something that has been abandoned. And here you can see on the slide also, like it's like he's like commanded like Abraham to leave his country. So it's the Gentile birth is not a trait, but it's like something that is abandoned. Pellegrino writes that he was born of a race people, like he used the word gente. Forgive me for my wrong Portuguese pronunciation. Far away from God, so apartada. While his conversion was a rapprochement to God. So like it's a spatial description of his distance from God. Another example that I showed in my presentation in the winter is the loving epitaph on the grave of Sarah Francesca, the French Sarah from 1697, that states that I left my father as my mother. So it's really it's a pride that you leave where you come from. The proselyte Hans Joosten, alias Abrams, who served as Shamash in Amsterdam between 1607 and 1613, claimed to have converted in the Ottoman Empire around 98 or 99, also emphasized his Christian roots and argued that he had converted not just to Judaism, but he had joined the tribe of Judah. Yeah, so this is really like, I have basically joined the Jewish people, even picked the tribe. So here, and this is very undramatic, name changes are harder to interpret, like, so what they mean, because this is also common throughout the history of conversion. Throughout religious history, name changes have indicated important changes, often magical, not only of selfhood, but also in kinship identity. Yet, while converts usually adopt the typical Jewish first names, and you can see them here, like this, these are basically all of the Jewish first names that were adopted, and nothing out of the ordinary here. That could also be conversos picking a Jewish name. But the patronyms and the last names are slightly more interesting. So the ones I underlined, they can be read as the proselyte being grafted into the Israelite people, if I can use the Pauline image. Whereas so Ben Avram, Bar Avram, Ben Jacob Avinu I counted once, which is a bit more rare, and often also Israel as the second name. So these are very common names, I think also common throughout the history of conversion, so it's hard to say something about it. So the word ger is a little bit more complicated. Hold on. Oh yeah, so if you use, first of all, if you take the Israel or Ben Avram Avinu, so what does this mean? Is it the substitute of lineage that endows the convert with Jewishness? Is it to ensure certain restrictions to inheritance and marriage for a full Jew that just doesn't have lineage? Or was it applied, as Orwell used the biblical word ger literally, as a stranger, as a marker of difference? Yeah, so this is unclear. Like, so if somebody is given the word ger, like, is it a badge of honor, or is it like this is something that distinguishes you from the others? So, and it seems that this it was really regarded as ambivalence. You can see it, for instance, in Jonathan Ger's Kesed Jonathan, the bow of Jonathan, like Kesed Jonathan, of course, in Hebrew, allegedly written by the proselyte headmaker Jan de Rijkszoon in Dutch in 1600, and surviving as a copy of a Portuguese translation made in 1664 by Samuel Abbas. There, he refers at times to the Jewish people in the first person plural. So he said, like, we, the Jewish people. In fact, and this is his slightly heretical twist, he regards all Christians not as ontologically different from Jews, but as Jews who have been seduced by evil to abandon the law. So he basically claims that everybody should observe the law. At the same time, Jonathan Ger appeals to the Deuteronomic and Leviticus appeal to love the proselyte like as yourself. So here I feel like this is kind of an appeal to his fellow Jews to treat me equal to. So this is kind of a sign that he wasn't treated equally. The fact, as Kaplan noted in his article, that there are several instances of candidates of conversion turned away by the Portuguese community, or that it ended up populating the list of the poor, does not always mean a racialized view of proselytes or the conviction they were not like other Jews. So let's talk first about the refusal. Even if the refusal was justified with the fact that the applicant was not of the Jewish caste, as in one case the term was used, this might not have been the real reason, but the lip service that the Dutch authorities had led it. There were other good reasons to refuse proselytes. For instance, since the Portuguese community was wealthy, it makes sense that they, more than other communities, felt the need to scrutinize the motivations of potential converts. And so throughout most of history, those who would convert to Judaism, you would not expect them to have any other benefits for them. So like basically, if you're crazy enough to convert to Judaism, fine. But in this case, like they felt the obligation to say, are these people not converting for reasons of gain? They do not want to enter this community. So in the halachic tradition that emphasizes the importance of motivations, which became dominant after Caro, there is a tradition. One tradition is that it demands motivation for the sake of heaven. And there's another tradition that only excludes certain motivations. And one of them is the sake of a royal table. So it's for like political position or for gain. It makes sense that the less than wealthy applicants were suspected of desiring to enter a rich community, either based on social reality or as an expression of the universal fear of the rich that everybody is out for their money. It could also have been an expression of social economic rather than racial difference, which would explain why in 1696 the former Augustinian friar Pablo Montañez was accepted after an appeal of community members on his behalf, who apparently socially accepted him. Another example is the case of Vicente or Isaac de Rocamora in the 1640s, whose request for conversion was granted because, as Abraham Idaña faced it a few years later, he was a person of such importance. This explains also why some proselytes, such as the Spanish Morisco actor that you wrote many years ago, Lorenzo Escudero, after having been refused by the Sephardim, was accepted by the much poorer Ashkenazi Jews, had less reason to suspect conversion for financial gain. So you have to think of this like halachic duty, like we have to research the motivations of the candidate, and the Sephardi Jews basically had an obligation to look into, like, are you maybe converting for this specific reason? Those who already worked on slavery in the Dutch colony might know more about slaves. So I've been reading about, like, so there's a different halacha for slaves, but I found nothing in the Dutch sources that actually discusses this. So several slaves are noted in Beth Chaim's borough register, for instance, as not having immersed themselves. So did these belong perhaps to that limbo halachic status invented to make slaves sufficiently Jewish to ensure a kosher kitchen, but not enough for their owner to manumit them? So here we have another reason to refuse conversion, not ironically in the case of slaves based on race, but on the economics of slavery. Yeah, so it's possible that they did not want to convert slaves, not because they were racist, but they needed slaves. The fact that many of the proselytes ended up on the charity roles of the Sephardic community can have other reasons than discrimination for race. First, it might mean something positive, namely that the Sephardic community was willing to accept poor candidates that they would like to have to support afterwards. Yeah, so it could be actually an act of generosity. Another reason for the frequent presence of converts on a charity list is that many were manumitted slaves slaves that were manumitted, and they of course had held an occupation before that was not very well remunerated. Moreover, there were also foreigners that came to convert or settle and were in need of assistance.
I'll give you 5 minutes.
It's going to be hard. I might then maybe skip this part. Okay, I'm going to need to be very quickly enough. So in addition to what can be called the social halachic reasons, there were other religious reasons, and to speed up things, please read this by yourself. This is a sermon from Shaul Levi Mortera from 1631. And he basically repeats Rabbi Herbo's horrible identification of proselytes with the skin boil. And what I think, however, is we can read this as a racist statement, but we can also read it in a literal way, namely not as a principled rejection of converts, but as a worry about adding another source of religious independence and idiosyncrasy to one already there, namely his own Jewish congregants. And I'm going to skip that part, but of course, like you all know about the unruly bunch of congregants Mortera had to deal with. In addition came a number of converts who also were holding unconventional views. For instance, Joten Ger, as well as 3 other proselytes from Born, who had been released from prison a year before Mortera's arrival in the Dutch Republic, believed that all Gentiles should convert to Judaism if their souls would be saved, a source for potential troubles. There were also a number of English who were arriving with doubtful religious beliefs. for instance, and I'm skipping really a lot here. Around 1620, the community, there was a Treskite Judaizing sect coming from England, and the community accepted one as a convert, and the other they convinced to be a Noahite only. And the reason was probably can be explained by his later actually went back to England and started proselyte everywhere Christian. So they thought maybe this guy is a little bit too fanatic to convert Christians, so let's not do this. Then we had a number of Shabbat or Christian Shabbat observers. I'm giving you the most interesting one. And this is actually two cases from after the sermon. In 1639, Paul the glassmaker became an obsession for the Reformed consistory because he frequented the synagogue on the Shabbat and behaved there like a Jew. And throughout repeated interrogations of this wayward church member, it became clear that the glassmaker held not merely beliefs that were deeply offended his Christian audience, but also were problematic for the Jews. For instance, he argued that Jesus was not God, but he was a prophet, or only a prophet. There was also a member of the Wallonian Reformed Church, who was called by his own church members a half-Jew, who did observe both the Christian and the Jewish Shabbat, sufficiently to anger both sides. Lastly, and this is something that, like, if a few more minutes, because this is another aspect that I think is important. These are the troublemakers. In his autobiography, Polemic, Pellegrino seemed to hold the ontological concept of blood and race that Robbie would write about later. So he talks about like he was by blood, the son of a Gentile, God hates Gentile blood. Yet, this racialized view of religious identity was not hegemonic. Notice, for instance, the identification of his people on spatial terms. But he was also Jew in another way. And this maybe I'm just going to tell you. He argued that he was a Jew, he had a Jewish soul. Yeah, so he was a Jewish, a sinning Jew in his previous life, and he believed that like a sinning Jew will transmigrate into the body of a Gentile as a form of penitence, and this Gentile, of course, then converts. So I've been trying to trace back this theology, and this theology has a tradition. For instance, Chaim Vital in his Shar Gilgulim describes a Gentile who is converting, gets inserted, exactly two souls in sequence into his body. Yeah, so the second one is a Jewish soul. So a Gentile who converts at the moment of his conversion gets a Jewish soul. Yeah, and I can trace this. One of the Dutch converts actually had been in Tzfat at the time that Vital was there, so it might have come from there. There was also another source. Our good friend Abu Fonseca also did argue something similar, that he had this fight with Mortera, that your sinning family members in Spain, and perhaps also our family members here who refuse to circumcise themselves, yeah, so they can be redeemed in the next life if they can redeem themselves through the transmigration of souls. Yeah, so people like Pellegrino took this to mean, and I don't know if Fonseca also meant this, took this to mean that a proselyte is in fact a transmigration of a sinful Jewish soul. Yeah? And in that sense, and this is the crux of my argument, in that sense, proselytes and so new Christians, yeah, are identified with another. So they're not regarded as distinct from each other, but actually, and these proselytes themselves, they did believe that, like, I must be a proselyte because I must be a Jew because I'm a proselyte because I must have been a sinful Jew. Yeah. If I had more time, I would have read this more in detail, but that is basically the crux of the argument.
Okay. We will take our time for questions and answers, because I think it's there will be many. So, because I've seen David's and I've seen Claude's And on the other side also, we'll start with this.
Okay, thank you, Alex, very interesting. Was it Cardoso or Orobio who said that you constitute a nation, whether good or bad?
That was Orobio.
Orobio, okay,
Yeah.
that's what I thought, thank you. That's it.
Which was also interesting, I think, because so basically bad Jews are in a sense Jews, and so the proselytes have to be good and they're loved by God if they're good, but they're not necessarily. Yeah, so it's a clear,
Yes.
it's an hierarchical distinction also.
Yes, Cardoso was, yes, I remember more open. He said, we don't proselyte people, but he didn't close completely the doors, like exceptions to the rule. Yeah, I have one comment is regarding the name Pellegrino.
Yeah.
Why Pellegrino, not Pellegrino? And perhaps this is a neologism, a kind of invented name. He took because doesn't make sense otherwise.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
anyway, like this is
And-
one of my questions, like the name Pellegrino is usually used for converts, but might it also be a regular Jewish last name, or would it be?
No,
No.
No? So it's a-
No.
it's a neologism like the Dana International, you know.
Yeah,
No, with all my
Yeah.
respect. And just two quickly things, we should remember one that following Ephraim Karnafogel's studies about Geirim in Ashkenaz in the Middle Age, he shows that the process of conversions was deeply influenced by the idea of baptism.
Yeah.
The Christian idea of baptism, which is
maybe the other way
important
around.
thing.
Yeah.
Secondly, we have to bear in mind that both Orobio de Castro and Cardoso, they developed at what I call a counter-Paulinian theology. And in order to be counter-Paulinian, you have to say, we don't do like the Christian, we don't use proselytism as a way of imperialism.
Yeah.
That is why they close the doors. And finally, remember also the famous response of Maimonides to Obadiah Ager, whether he could say as a cantor, our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I was converted to Judaism. And then what Maimonides says is, you were converted, but if you are Jewish, it's like retroactively you were in the Sinai. Then he doesn't use the metempsychosis, but the fact that when you enter into the covenant retroactively is as if you were in the Mount Sinai with the rest of the Jews. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Only very briefly. First of all, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. And this is a good opportunity to say that the man who wrote the nonsense about proselytes and the converts was Joseph Kaplan 40 years ago.
Oh, this was actually 2019 article.
That is very, very great. I'm sorry for that. But
No,
that means,
I think
but
you're
that
right.
means,
Yeah.
that means that Kaplan of 2019 didn't check correctly things that he had written many years ago. I think that I agree with what I said about the reticence of the Sephardi Jews to proselytize. But on the other hand, I wouldn't say today that that is the influence of the limpieza de sangre. That's all.
But it might have been there though, so, but it was one of the, and also and this is something that, of course, I didn't have time, there's a difference between the early on in the century when it's like Israel in the 1970s, whoever wants to immigrate can come, and Israel in the 2012s. So like things change, and Robia was like much later on in the century, whereas like many of my cases from earlier on in the century.
We go to the next one, and then one more question, and then the ones who want to question can use the coffee break or the tea break. So,
First, very quickly, my understanding is that candidates for conversion who are Iberian were given a kind of consideration that non-Iberians were not. I don't know if that's correct or not, but I think that has been observed. But I think my main point is this, that rabbinic conversion leaves a lot of discretion to the rabbis. And here we don't have the tshuvot of rabbinic figures. So regardless of what's in the Shulchan Aruch, we don't know what was involved in each individual, and it is a very individual kind of decision. So that just as
So yeah, maybe
kind
the
of
two
footnote.
most important sources are missing, which is like anything from a Bedin. And
Right.
Charlotte Chuvot, like I tried to find, but nothing on
Right.
Shlomi
For
or
For example, Maimonides in the code, in his code, the Mishnah Torah, you have one thing. It's quite, there's quite a lot of variation if you look at his tshuvot, including the letter to
Yes.
Obadiah,
Yeah.
but others as well.
Yeah, and also my most interesting because he also was really considerate of circumstances. So he was prepared to go against tradition if it was for the benefit of the specific people involved. So
That's exactly the point, the situational
Yes.
decision making of
Yes.
rabbis.
Yeah, yeah. Good point, yeah.
Special exception.
Question,
Ooh.
I saw, and also, who was first?
Yeah.
No, ladies first.
Really meaning very quickly, just,
Is it possible to show the floor?
I don't know,
Good morning, everyone.
Is it possible to what?
To what?
Show the floor.
To show the floor, because I'm seeing you very tiny.
oh, he wants you to stop sharing the PowerPoint so that you can see
Or
the image of us.
Okay.
the loudest has
Well, you know, just very quickly.
Yeah.
Question that occurred to me about the question of racial or bloodline conception of conversion and whether there's any, whether it devolves on the children.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's one thing to continue to think of the convert him or herself as being some kind of, but if it's truly understood in the bloodline, you would think that there would continue to be.
Yeah, so in Arabia's case, it really describes it like in the descendants of converts are basically dissolving into the Jewish people. Yeah, so and I've seen like families who the converts who they really do disappear. So it seems like I'm not an halachic expert. I know there's some issues of inheritance with converts, but apparently that changes over generations already. And of course, like there's also really a topic I even didn't get into, like the conversion of children, which did take place, which is also a really interesting case and the fights about it.
The last question for say, and then we're going to the short.
Very short, because this model, I'm not speaking about the question of the blood, because it's different. But the way of the Jew,
Yeah.
it seems the same of the process, the contemporary of the catechumens, the conversion of the Jews and Muslims in the Balkans, for example, Ukraine and Venezuela. So the model is the same of the foundation of these schools for these people that are using and Jews to convert, and they are referred as a new people. Also, the way of the dress in white, so it seems the same process.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not the same, but it seems a model of confessionalization, the model of confessionalization, it seems the same.
I actually did have a last slide that I didn't get to because my bad timing and
Sorry, just closed your thing.
yeah, so that's fine. So it was an image of the penitential dress of the Inquisition, because I often felt like there should have been a Jewish version of it in Amsterdam of proselytes wearing it like I'm a penitent new Christian who has refused to But thanks.